national organization interested in connective tissue and how we actually foster a conversation about Canadian cities coast to coast. And we've been in Edmonton all week. We've been hearing the best and the worst and the challenges and the opportunities and everything that Edmontonians are wrestling with, coming to terms with, experimenting with. It's really been very, very exciting for us. We had hoped, of course, to be literally there, but the COVID reality meant we couldn't be. But one of the little silver linings, hard to imagine there are very many, but one of the silver linings of the COVID situation is that we can virtually gather like we are now. We don't have anybody complaining about travel time. We don't have anybody missing planes. We all are having this collective national conversation. And it's been really, really instructive for us to watch how COVID has accelerated our sense of collectiveness around urban Canada and how important it is for us now to extend our conversation today beyond Edmonton, but to these other sister cities in the region. So I'm obviously participating from Toronto, and if I could show you my outdoor, you'll see we don't have any snow. But it's a little chilly here, just saying. And Toronto is the traditional territory of many First Nations, as we know. The Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across what was and is still called Turtle Island. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, which is signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties that were signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. Also, because we're participating in Edmonton all week, that is in Treaty 6 territory. The mayor may correct me on this, but this is land that's been occupied, traveled, and cared for by a number of Indigenous peoples. Places traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Anishinaabe, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce these things. So Mayor Iveson, I'm going to rely on you to give us a land acknowledgement for Edmonton so that I don't completely cock it up. And just to say that we are coming to terms here in our work as urbanists in every environment we find ourselves about the legacies of exclusion and the challenges that we all have to build our cities differently and to try to move forward out of this extraordinary moment, this global pandemic moment, to see what our cities need to look like in the future. And so we're very appreciative to have 4 of Alberta's leading civic leaders who are championing their own cities, but also thinking regionally about what the future are. So I'm going to go to you first, Mayor Iveson, to correct my botch at the land acknowledgement. And then if you could start talking to us a little bit about what you see as the sort of pressing challenge Edmonton is coming to terms with through COVID and how you imagine you're going to emerge and what you're going to need. And then I'm going to go to your colleagues and we'll have a broader conversation. So over to you first, Mayor Iveson.
Well, I'll say Tanse Abuashtid Etlanita. Bonjour and hello. Some of the languages you hear in this territory, which is Treaty 6 territory, Métis Region Zone 4, and pleased to be joined by colleagues from Treaty 8 and Treaty 7 territory here in Alberta as well. As all of us here join you as part of the extended Red Deer Metropolitan Region, which, as Tara will note, is really the center of central Alberta. And so all roads lead in Alberta to one of our cities that are on this call, from Lethbridge to Red Deer to Grande Prairie. And, the Alaska Highway from here runs all the way up to through Grande Prairie and all the way up to the north. And the Canamex trade corridor runs from Edmonton south through Red Deer and Calgary and Lethbridge all the way to the Montana border. No traffic lights all the way to Mexico. So we are all critical parts of the logistics and trade infrastructure of this country from north to south. And of course, all the east-west connects through here too. And what I'll say maybe about the pandemic is that it has exposed the fragility of all municipalities, particularly cities. And it's not just exposed the fragility of municipal corporations, and we can talk about those specifically, but of our communities where people concentrate who are most vulnerable. And I'm going to say first, actually, and I will talk about vulnerable human beings, but I'm going to say vulnerable businesses. Small businesses in our community are struggling immensely. And at the earliest stages of this crisis back in March and April, I chair the big city mayors in this country, and both in our conversations at that chat table and with our neighbors in the region here in Edmonton Metro, so much of our conversation was about small business and what this is going to mean for our entrepreneurs in our community, and also what it's going to mean for vulnerable people. And I want to say that consistently in this crisis, municipal leaders have put the interests of our vulnerable parts of our business community and vulnerable parts of our social fabric ahead of our own needs, sometimes to our detriment. While making sure that they got the support they needed from senior orders of government as well as from us, whether it was for housing or whether it was for rent subsidy for businesses, or eviction supports for vulnerable people to prevent them from being evicted. And so I think all of the frailties of our systems have been exposed by this, particularly where vulnerable people and vulnerable organizations concentrate, which is in our cities. And I should just say, not to diminish at all the challenges this is having in rural parts of the country and the issues with broadband connectivity as an essential services and other issues that have come to fore. But for cities, I think as the organizations of government closest to the ground, we've seen up front the impacts on Main Street to businesses that have already failed or are concerned that failure is around the corner. And we've seen on the ground the challenges with, after more than a decade of bringing homelessness down through Housing First and showing that you can not only drop homelessness in half, but actually set a credible goal to end it, at least functionally, from one day to the next, that homelessness has started to rise in light of COVID. And cities are hubs where people come when they're struggling, and I think that that's going to put even more pressure on us in the coming months and years here. But then fundamentally, fiscally for us, the inflexibility of property tax, both for the taxpayer and for the city, that's come to light. And the limitations we have with respect to dependency on senior orders of government to do what needs to be done has really been exposed. And where all orders of government are pulling in the right direction, you can do extraordinary things in this country. If they're not, and we could say a little bit more about that, serious now life and death problems come into focus. And so lots that we can talk about. I'll leave it there because I think my colleagues will have important things to add. And then I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mary, for bringing the Canadian Urban Institute to our city and our region.
We're learning a ton, and we're very appreciative of all the things that you're trying there and the lessons that you're learning and all the, we used to talk in urban life about, a pilot. We want to try something. Let's try a pilot. Now we're all on one big pilot, urban life is one big pilot everywhere. If I can encourage people to participate in the chat, it's great that you're telling us where you're coming from. Always interesting for us. Adjust your settings though, so that it says to panelists and everyone, it's the top thing, or panelists and attendees, I think, so that we can all see what everybody is saying back and forth. And just remember that we videotape these sessions and we record the chat. And so whatever you put up there stays there. Just saying. Okay, so I'm interested if we would now go to you, Mayor Given, because you and I had a little bit of a chat before we started about Grande Prairie, your 70,000 in your core city and then another 25 in the region. I'm appreciative that we want to hear the regional perspective. And I appreciate the geography you gave us there, Don, because it helps us orient and understand the kind of access points and how, these economic conditions are felt regionally, we know, and also your shout out to what's happening to independent and small businesses. We at COI have been doing Bring Back Main Street with a lot of your participation and support, and we really feel that that is a universal challenge in every community of every size, interestingly, across the country. Downtown Toronto, downtown Montreal, and Grande Prairie and Red Deer, and I'm sure that I'm going to hear the same about Lethbridge. So let's go. Bill, Mayor Bill, talk to us.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You've really got a pan-Albertan panel here, which is great to see. And, all of us really exist in a regional context. Don's regional context is a little bit different from the other three of us. But, I think the impact of the pandemic on cities is one thing, but cities are sort of I think they're an anachronism, actually. I think metro areas are what we need to be thinking about in Don's case, and not that I'll tell him what he should be thinking about. But I think across the province, we know so much more about how economies work across boundaries. We know so much more about how we're all impacted by things like climate change and water quality and air quality. We understand that people live their lives in a multi-municipal context. But here in Alberta, and certainly really across the West, our local government structures are set up on the basis of how far you could travel in a horse and wagon in a day. And I would suggest that that is not the most relevant way to structure local governments for the modern world, where we need to deal with things like pandemics, like global financial crisis, like climate change. And so I really think that for our province, this pandemic and the fiscal crisis that we have here in Alberta really should offer us a chance to reimagine local government structures in a modern way that could be more effective on all those different dimensions. Sadly, I think we've seen in this province that there has not been the courage from the provincial government to actually take any active steps towards doing something about that, to help structure modern local governments that would have the appropriate capacity to deal with the challenges that we face in the 21st century. In other provinces, I know, when provincial governments do decide to take an active role, I know the results are mixed. But here in Alberta, I think it's really very opposite. We've seen a lack of action from successive provincial governments, and that means that Alberta municipalities are not equipped to be able to compete in this globalized context that we're in.
Boy, Mayor, given you've just introduced a whole new notion of is the city the archaic form, and do we need some other form? We had a city talk earlier this week about charter cities and more power for cities, and actually Mayor Iveson's chief of staff was on that call talking about navigating charters and is that a useful tool or not. And we had a conversation across the country, and we had an academic Canadian transplanted to Texas who said what we really need is provincial governments to get constitutions and to start talking about establishing different relationships with their municipalities. That kind of blew the water out of places.
The other thing that Mayor, the other thing that you could say is we need to get provincial governments out of the way. There are things at a national scale that need to be handled nationally, and I absolutely believe that. I find myself often wondering what exactly it is the province does that appropriately structured local governments couldn't do on their own. So the question is not whether local governments have enough authority, it's whether provincial governments have too much.
That's a chatty little topic. Okay, well, the thing about this that's so interesting, though, is it's forcing us to really look carefully at who should be doing what. Who is best suited for designing policy, figuring out what the problems are, figuring out what the solutions are, and then how does it get paid for? And then how do we as residents who pay taxes, how do we then hold someone clearly accountable for what's not happening? One of the things I want to talk with you about is homelessness and housing, because I feel like you've collectively kind of decided to go your own way and solve it and not wait for anybody to give you permission to do it. So there's some wiggle room that I'm observing that I feel in true Albertan get it done kind of attitude. You're taking matters into your own hands. But as you say, maybe it takes a while for the structures to catch up with what actually you're already doing. So Tara, can we hear from you, please? Your perspective on this. Do you think that it's time for municipal governments to be, are they archaic? That form?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I'd like to start off by thanking the Canadian Urban Institute and welcome everybody who's joined us. Honored to be on the panel today with colleagues and my friends. I've had a chance to work with all three mayors in terms of advocacy to the provincial government. It's a loss to their communities and to Albertans that Mayor Given and Mayor Iveson have opted not to run again, but we wish them well in their future endeavors. So I just want to say that just incredible leaders who really have transformed the municipal landscape in our province and have set the stage for what is to come. So I'll just address your question in general and then hone it down to the specific question you've raised around the pandemic. It is time for a new arrangement. I mean, municipalities for many years have sounded the alarm, trying to end the traditional non-constitutionally recognized relationship, this, parent type of child, systemic frustration that we experience. And we've tried different methods to deal with that. But I concur with Mayor Iveson's point in the fact that the very points that we've made for many, many years, the pandemic has completely exposed the very points that we've been making. Mm-hmm. Find that the time to plan for an emergency is before an emergency, and thankfully our city's been in fairly strong position In fact, because we've run through this scenarios. In fact, sometimes we do such great emergency planning where 3 for 3, the emergency we plan ends up happening. So
what are you planning for next? Just give us
exactly. I know I've said stop planning. You know, but we've seen the public weaknesses and the private weaknesses. So publicly, it's exposed that the fiscal frameworks and the decision-making tools and the systemic structures that municipalities are working for no longer meet the expectations of our public in terms of who and what they want municipalities to attend to, because we're the government closest to the people. But on a second point, publicly, it also demonstrates the lack of harmonization between, you know, this complex bureaucratic navigation between a federal order of government saying this and a provincial order of government doing one thing, and then in some of those gaps of public policy gaps, municipalities having to step in. It's also exposed, as was referenced, with respect to the private sector, with what households and businesses are able to sustain in a non-diversified economy, and as well as the vulnerable, those vulnerabilities being exacerbated by the pandemic. The final point that I'll make in terms, I just want to pick up on this point of harmonization in the regions. We, you know, as Mayor Given referenced, we don't live, work, and recreate with borders. And as Albertans, actually, it's not even on a regional basis. Albertans are very, very fluid in our travel patterns throughout our province. But, you know, the pandemic really exemplifies that. You know, we have a lack of harmonization provincially or regionally, even with our pandemic response. And yet we all share the same hospital. And, you know, so when we have a patchwork of response to it, really, we all share the same hospital. And if our objective is to flatten the curve and minimize hospitalizations, that regional harmonization and partnership is even more critical.
I mean, you're right that this crisis has just, you know, everything bleeds into everything else. So just the comments that Bill was making, you know, watersheds don't actually correspond to municipal boundaries, nor do pandemic travel. We have an interesting situation in Ontario where the provincial government made a choice a couple of weeks ago to lock down certain municipal bordered areas, right? So it locked down a region in Toronto. The dilemma, of course, is that people then just drive outside of the region, and that it's hard to get a regionally consistent response. People appreciate what he was trying to do, but it just ends up, I think, the absence of any kind of formal mechanism that would have been in the deliberations about that decision. That's what so often is missing. You all have to deal with decisions that are taken where you weren't consulted, where there wasn't the understanding that you're all different. You know, it's very tricky. Go ahead, Mayor Spearman. Let's hear your views on this. And generally tell us a little bit, if you could, about Lethbridge and what you've been dealing with there.
We're the most southern city. We're about an hour north of the US border. Highways 2, 3, 4, and 5 flow through Lethbridge. So there's a lot of commercial traffic through our city. We're a hub of Southwest Alberta. And in fact, at 1 o'clock, which is in about 11 minutes, I'm hosting a regional meeting of the municipalities in Southwest Alberta. So we are in the traditional land of the Blackfoot people, and we don't talk about the treaty because to the Blackfoot people, the treaty is an insult. So it was how their rights were limited. Right. So it's the land of the Blackfoot people, not Treaty 7 land in our case. So one of our key initiatives in this council term has been to enhance reconciliation. So we've done things like we adopted Oki, which is the word welcome in Blackfoot, as our official greeting for the city of Lethbridge. We have monthly reconciliation meetings with our Indigenous community. We're trying to build ways of working together on economic opportunity, addressing social issues. These are all things that, again, are borderless. But we do the same with the surrounding towns. When it comes to economic development, we want to be focused on strategic, catalytic economic development. So we need to work with the province and with the federal government on things like airport development. That's key to our future. We're building an agri-food hub in Lethbridge, which is technology enhanced agriculture and a learning center in partnership with our university and our college. So we're lucky to have both a university and a college, which are highly thought of by our local businesses and have great partnerships. But Lethbridge has some significant social issues and high levels of poverty, and racism has been a factor in overcoming that, which is why reconciliation is so important to us, and making sure that everybody has the same opportunity. Our city motto is Gateway to Opportunity, and that should be gateway to opportunity for everyone who lives here, regardless of race, background, place of origin. We've got to make sure we know that everybody wants the same outcome. They want their younger people to be happy and secure. And we certainly have some challenges in achieving that. And we need to work with the province to make sure that we have affordable housing. Our homeless numbers have doubled through the pandemic, and it's just a tremendous pressure. I'm sure the other cities will say, when you have an outbreak at your homeless shelter, you're very limited in what your options are. We don't have backup plans, and we're struggling to accommodate challenges like that. So the people who are marginalized, the underprivileged, those people will be suffering the most. But certainly, as a hub city, we have additional responsibilities, and it's been brought to my attention. I'm sure we're going to be discussing it this afternoon. We have a regional hospital, but as we approach the point where the regional hospital can't accept any more people, all the people in the local hospitals in the areas around us that can no longer be sent into our hospital, right, where we have the equipment, this pandemic is going to negatively impact people in rural areas. To this point, they felt in many cases that it wasn't going to impact them. But as we're seeing the numbers rise in rural areas throughout the province, the onus is going to be on cities like the hub cities, like Lethbridge, Red Deer, Grande Prairie, Calgary, and Edmonton, to accept and absorb some of the issues from the surrounding areas. So that's what I see.
Mm-hmm. When you say hub city, Mayor Spearman, is that an actual term that is formally adopted, and that there are a number of cities that you are called hub cities in Alberta, or are you just adopting that as because you have traits, similar kinds of connectivity traits?
Yeah, in Alberta there are several. We have over 20 mid-sized cities, and they have populations from 20,000 up. Yep. Some would be suburbs. I don't want to say that in a derogatory sense, but some are very close to Calgary and Edmonton. Right. So, and then there are others that are like Calgary, Red Deer, Grande Prairie, that are regional hubs. So the areas around us depend on us for services. We have things like regional hospitals, and we're the major shopping hubs and that type of things. There's a lot of flow in and out of our cities and the areas around us.
But I think it's a term of art that Chris has coined, but I think it's based in fact and the facts on the ground about the way our communities work. But it isn't recognized in legislation, which is maybe kind of my point that it should be.
So it's not recognized in legislation. Go ahead, Tara. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, historically, the government of Alberta has had a phrase, which us mid-sized city caucus mayors generally weren't in favor of, but the government refers to Edmonton, Calgary, and the ROA, meaning the rest of Alberta. We're a member of, and there's, 365 plus municipalities in Alberta, and, everybody has unique needs and interests. So arising out of our mid-sized caucus, of which there's about 22 urban centers, certainly not in the same metro size as Edmonton or Calgary, but that regional hub communities perspective really was a response to the new reality that many of us have made over the past few years, is the fact we don't live, work, and recreate with a border. And regional hub cities, Mayor Spearman had referenced which ones they are specifically, do play a different role. So our hope is to transition the government's viewpoint So, Edmonton, Calgary, regional hub cities, and then perhaps some other term for the remaining 360 municipalities.
Or less.
No more of the RO.
Or less. Or less if Mayor Given gets his dream.
I think we can do it with under 100.
Yeah.
So John, you made this point about all the fragility. I'm recognizing that Mayor Spearman may have to step away, but Don, you talked about all the fragility, and Mayor Spearman just talked about, here's an example where there is a complete interdependence in these regional hubs for healthcare support, and this fragility existed before, and now COVID's going to make it really clear that these kinds of arrangements just aren't resilient enough, right? So what kind of potential changes would you imagine as one of the two named cities in the Alberta regime of Edmonton? Don, what do you see?
Well, first of all, I think you'll see why I like working with these other mayors so much. And there are more great mayors in Alberta. And when you put the mid-sized cities in Edmonton and Calgary together, you got 3 million people who want to live in great cities of various sizes and large towns across the province. And one thing that's not well known about Alberta that'll frame what I'm going to say next that will actually answer your question is that this is, I think, the second most urbanized province in the country. And the postcards and the Travel Alberta aesthetic is not that. And we have a brilliant and proud rural and agricultural past and present. But this is one of the most urbanized places in the country. And we tried to get the legislation to reflect that. So the Municipal Government Act has made some good steps forward. A lot of things that Edmonton and Calgary were trying to get in the city charter ended up coming to all of us in the Municipal Government Act because they made sense for all municipalities. But I really do think that municipalities of scale, and that includes everyone on this call, not just Edmonton and Calgary, can be entrusted to do more. And in fact, that we are leaving better results on the table and leaving money on the table by not working together more effectively. And I'll give you a concrete example of this, which is that, when the Black Lives Matter and Defund the Police rallies were happening around the world and across our country, and in each one of our communities, incidentally, folks came forward and said, we're not doing a good enough job of supporting people who experience discrimination on the basis of being racialized, either Indigenous or people of color in our communities, and that they need to be empowered more with supports and key infrastructure like housing and mental health and childcare and community development. And the call, interestingly, came to us as defund police so we can fund those things. And my first response to this was a not very well received civics lesson on, well, most of the things you want, I want, and I've been advocating for the provincial government to act in its area of jurisdiction to do more of the right preventative things in each one of those areas through our anti-poverty strategy, through our end homelessness work. So I'm sort of agreeing that there's a deficit in those areas, but also pointing out that you've actually got to fund those things and get better results. So the case I would want to make is that bringing cities in to delivering more of that work in partnership with agencies on the ground at the community level in a more transparent and accountable way, I'm sure that with the money that's in the system today, that goes into trying to move the needle on the social determinants of health, that if cities were driving that with federal and provincial investment and reporting on our results, I'd 100% love to compete with each of the other folks on this call for delivering the best results I can to build better lives for people so that I can reduce their interaction with police, reduce their interaction with the justice system, reduce their interaction with the healthcare system. And by the way, the premiers just asked the federal government for a 50% permanent increase in the health and social transfers because of COVID. And their fiscal situation is almost as devastated as ours, but they can run deficits. We can't. So we have a more immediate limitation. But nonetheless, I have some sympathy for their call for the need. But until we really get strategic about how we're going to move the needle on healthier and safer communities from the bottom up, not from the top down, we're just going to keep pouring money in for mixed results at best. So I really do think that if we empowered communities at a regional scale to work systemically and strategically, that we could get for the money that's in the system way better outcomes on health, way better outcomes on justice. And then in turn, police could actually chase the real bad guys who are victimizing the people experiencing poverty and victimizing the people who are being re-traumatized every day, survivors of residential schools, and folks who moved here as refugees, former child soldiers, veterans with PTSD. That's our homeless population. Stories of trauma. And there is a better way to support those people than the way the billions and billions of dollars are being spent today. And I think if you put some of it in the hands of cities with real coordinating and convening power, I'm sure we could do a better job for Canadians.
Let's talk a bit about this regional approach that you're doing. And I just want to respond to something that's animated on the chat, because I sometimes do. Just for Christopher Wilson's benefit, we're in Calgary all week next week. We're doing a residency this week. I would have been sorry if there wasn't a little bit of Calgary, Edmonton stuff going on. And so we've been in Edmonton all this week, and in Calgary, we're in Calgary all next week, and we have a City Talk for Calgary as well. And Mayor Nenshi has been on not one, but 2 City Talks, including one about 3 weeks ago. So we are very appreciative that there are a diverse number of views, and we want to get as much municipal leadership input as we can. So let's talk a little bit about the regional piece, if you could. You're already saying informally, you're already kind of doing it. We are hearing from our consultations that it sounds as if your region may well be the first in Canada to actually eliminate homelessness, even though I'm hearing from Mayor Spearman that it's particularly challenging. Can I get a sense from you, are there other areas where you think you as municipal leaders are particularly innovative? Other things that you've been doing really, really well and smartly that we need to be watching and paying attention to? Bill.
Yeah, well, I think one of the areas that municipalities could be doing more if the structures were appropriately set up would be environmental initiatives. Certainly in Alberta, the province and our current provincial government is looking to reduce the scope and size of government, of the provincial government's footprint. I think that that's pretty clear. And that is a choice that they're making. I think if municipal governments were structured appropriately, we would have the capacity to deal with environmental initiatives in a much more intuitive way that is more aligned with local needs and priorities. I appreciate that we need to have strong environmental regulations at much larger scales than even regional municipal governments could do. I fully acknowledge that and appreciate that. But I think in terms of the actual on-the-ground work with NGOs, with citizens, I think that the idea of subsidiary and trying to ensure that services and functions of government are delivered by the level of government most closely to the people. I think there's lots of different areas where local governments are doing great work and are better suited than provincial governments doing it.
This is this European concept, and I see Iveson later is citing it. It comes up repeatedly on City Talk. We're all becoming experts on subsidiarity, which is basically, as you just suggested, Bill, it's the idea that the service that's the service is delivered by the order of government closest to the recipient of the service, and that means it needs to be funded and designed and implemented there. Tell me about whether, one of the things that we had some pushback on is that one might think that a conservative government of any description might be amenable to this because it's about getting more decentralization and power to the people. Does anybody want to comment on trying to have that conversation particularly with the conservative folks, not just in your provincial government? I know you have conservative council members too, for sure. Cara, how do you navigate that?
So I will say this, I think on principle, what we often hear is this idea of partnership and working together and leveraging of resources. And I will say, over the past couple of years and perhaps over the past decade, our infrastructure grants are generally looked more favorably as a regional hub city when we can show that it's serving the region as well. Some of our key advocacy initiatives that we've done in terms of, core provincial infrastructure that our community needs, if it's serving the region instead of just City of Red Deer proper, that's often looked at more favorably. But I think that the challenge of it is, and Mayor Spearman and I and Mayor Scott from Wood Buffalo and Mayor Nenshi from Calgary, we have a classic example right now where the conservative principle of regionalization or decentralization in a time of economic scarcity, we're seeing a shift towards consolidation.
Yeah.
Ambulance dispatch is the issue I'm referencing. Where historically that it actually makes far more sense to deliver that on a regional basis get the economies of scale, but it's also close to the people. But in the new economic normal, we're seeing this complete centralization of a service that should be delivered on a regional basis, and that we've said we're willing, we're able, and we're willing to even foot the bill if it comes to that, because that's what's right for the people. I'd like to respond and add to what Mayor Given had said in terms of, where are municipalities at in terms of, what can we pivot and do better or quicker? Mayor Iveson will often talk about, our constitutionally, municipalities aren't recognized, and we have this consequence of that. But yet the expectations of our citizens, we're the government closest to the people.
Yeah.
I think our public will understand. On paper, we can say, well, this is federal jurisdiction, and this is provincial jurisdiction, and this is municipal jurisdiction. But people at the end of the day, they don't really care. They want great services, they want a quality of life, and they want us to address problems. To a certain extent, it is an inherent tension of being a municipal leader, because you have to tell the truth, and you don't want to blame shift, but you have to tell the truth and call out the systemic challenges that we're faced with in terms, well, that's the feds or that's the province.
Yeah.
Not resonate with people for leaders to finger point. So it's an inherent tension where you're always pointing the finger to the correct jurisdiction, but then you can only do that insofar it's so far and make the point on principle, where then as a leader, you have an ethical imperative to say, okay, we're not getting the shelter or housing infrastructure meeting, so we're going to pivot locally and respond.
Just do it.
That's a great example. So, I've really seen a transition where we're the lines between jurisdiction haven't been redrawn, but they have been in a de facto way. And, municipalities talk about downloads, but at some point we just say, well, we have a problem. It's not getting fixed. This is a 10-year social infrastructure deficit. So we're just going to do it. And same thing on environmental initiatives or economic diversification. Mm-hmm. So it is an inherent tension that we're faced with, where trying to, on one hand, resolve this systemic inequity or structural issues, but at the same time be a responsive, ethical leader in responding to the challenges of our day.
Certainly during COVID, you haven't spent 10 seconds saying, sorry, we can't do that. It's not in our jurisdiction. You've had to do it.
Well, that's a great example. There's times where we've said, look, what we watch the press conferences daily, and then, we have a debrief and say, we need a day or two to figure out what this means for us. And then we might add our own local enhancements to that, but so it's trying to respond to what the health authority is saying, but also saying that we have to look at our own local circumstances and do what we think is right to keep people safe and healthy, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think it's important too to recognize that in Alberta, municipalities, aren't delegated any responsibility for public health. I know in Ontario, we see Ontario municipalities with public health officers. That's not something that Alberta municipalities have any jurisdiction over. And so we're actually caught often, certainly at the mid-sized city scale, of trying to interpret provincial direction and medical advice and understand what that means for things like mask mandates and other things, and appreciate the work that local governments are doing in the absence of good quality information. And so, not that I'm not sure that I would want to ask for additional authority without the resources to be able to do it, to be clear. But I think many Ontario municipalities are able to respond more effectively because they have health professionals working for them, because that's a responsibility of municipalities in those areas. And in Alberta, that responsibility is held closely by the provincial government, and getting information out in a timely manner can be really difficult and a real challenge in responding.
Bill, it's going to be a tough question to talk about now. You're going to have to wait a few months till you can actually have that conversation, because you're in the throes of coping with the system you've got, right? Yeah. But going forward, are you going to be able to go back and say, if we were resourced differently, we would have contained this differently?
Well, I think mayors across the province are saying that now.
They are saying.
And I think Albertans are saying that's what they want us to do. And the challenge is we don't quite have the tools, and even some of the tools we have under emergency management legislation, we can put in place states of local emergency. We can pass orders under our emergency management authority, but those can be countermanded by the province. And so we're in a pretty precarious and paternalistic scenario there. So we really do rely on the province. And again, in a region like mine, and we went back and forth on this around masks, it would have made a lot more sense to have a mask rule for Edmonton Metro, because people live in the county, work in the city, visit relatives in the town just outside of our boundaries. And that's why you want a consistent approach to these things. In the end, it was quite clear the province wasn't going to go anywhere near masks. And 5 months later, they have finally, but only in response to these numbers that we're seeing now. And frankly, we bought them time by going ahead in the major centers in Edmonton and Calgary. But the virus leaked out in a borderless way to the rest of the province. And it's just an illustration of the fact where the right level of authority for some of these things really is at the metropolitan scale because of integrated transportation and labor movement patterns, infrastructure systems, economies, businesses you would want to treat differently in terms of, equitably in terms of restrictions from one community to the next from a level playing field point of view. And so I think that's where the case for metropolitan scale, whether it's Grande Prairie region or whether it's Edmonton or Calgary region, the virus keeps proving that point. And so if it was to be delegated, I'd want it to be delegated to a regional authority that could act swiftly and decisively, or I would want my province to, well, I'll save comment on how I would like the province to do it, though I'm providing feedback even today on what I would like to see happen, at least at the metro scale here. But again, you're back in the situation that Tara said. If the action doesn't come, my public is screaming for stronger measures right now. I've got businesses asking to be shut down so that they can maximize their access to federal aid. We're always left in this unenviable frontline position. And yet I marvel at the work that folks like these and our city councilors and our civic administrators do in that next to impossible situation with way less resources than the other orders of government.
Well, as I was saying before, we're on this one big pilot right now where we're learning what's working and what isn't. And it's a cautionary tale that it takes a crisis like this with lives lost that may be the thing that we need to actually realign who's doing what and how we get things paid for. I appreciate very much the perspective you folks have offered around the metropolitan level. And as you said, Dawn, that you're actually the second most urbanized part of the country, which is important for people to recognize. So again, I think people will look to the lessons, and you have, Tara, you just mentioned it. We are aware that you went ahead and have just started solving things, whether they're in your jurisdiction or not. And that's a kind of resourcefulness that I think the rest of us need to listen to, and that we hope that the provincial level, not just your province, but other provinces, and of course the federal government, will recognize that there's all sorts of examples of this kind of thing. We've only got 2 more minutes left. Is there anything that you want to add in before I release you to get back to your budgetary negotiations or whatever it is or the public health challenges that you're facing, of course? Anybody want to add anything? Tara, anything from you?
Lino, I noticed here just had asked about, intermunicipal cooperation. And I think that's a great question, because that's a question all three of us now have fully addressed. I do think that there is a general spirit of, cooperation, but I will say this, the way that the current fiscal frameworks work, government funding, current definitions of municipalities, and the way that infrastructure dollars are awarded, it actually positions us as competitors and not neighbors. So systemically, we're competitors and we're not neighbors. We have a great example of a $90 million overpass that was funded by the province because, our neighbor is a rural municipality and the government pays for that. If it had been rural, if that had been within our borders, that would have been through the property tax base. So as much as there is a spirit of cooperation and willingness, there is a protectionism and a territoriality because if you follow the bunny, it rewards that unfortunate division and divides us as competitors, unfortunately.
Well, that's pretty interesting. How do we move to a collaborative cooperation, as you say, and would a regional understanding help us? Dawn, what did you want to add in?
Well, I was going to say something different, but I'll pick up on this. Our police chief has a great way of talking about this. This is collaboration without accountability is just talk, but partnership requires real accountability. It's the difference between dating and getting married. And what we really need is to solidify relationships and accountabilities to really deliver better results. Otherwise, we're just talking about this stuff. So that's the systemic change I hope that comes out of this on the fiscal arrangements for all orders of government and how we measure and deliver better integrated services for people at a scale that makes sense. So I also hope that that'll be one of the things that gets adjusted out of this amidst the scarcity that particularly provinces are soon to face. I remember talking to Bill Morneau early in the crisis, and he told me at that point that several provinces, including ours, were unable to get anyone to buy their debt. And they were basically on the dole of the federal government at that point, as were we, because I was phoning him to beg for money to save transit systems and rec centers. And so there's going to be a major reordering of these, but that's an opportunity to really realign this to get better results for people, environmentally, socially, and economically.
Last word to you, Mayor Given.
Yeah, well, just one thing. I believe that there's a lot of urban policy geeks on this call. I know you've got at least 3 of them on screen. I'm going to put you in there, Mary. That's 4. And I would just invite everybody to have a look. The Alberta Urban Municipalities Association has launched a multi-year project to look at the future of local government in Alberta and actually local governance. We're working with the Calgary School of Public Policy, looking for ideas from all across the country to reimagine what local government could look like in an Alberta context. So a lot of these issues that we're discussing may come up there. And so for all of you policy geeks, like me, like Tara, like Dawn, would encourage you to see if you can connect in with that initiative, because I think we have a moment in Alberta, maybe resulting from the dual crises that we're facing, to really reimagine what local governance could look like and how that could benefit Albertans. And I'm sure that there are models and information from across the country that would be helpful in that initiative.
I hope our city talkers, that not only are they learning about subsidiarity, but they're also learning about governance and what governance is. So thank you very much for joining us, all 3 of you, and for Mayor Spearman who had to leave. And we particularly appreciate you taking time at a particularly challenging time in terms of your own fiscal position and your budgets, but also what Alberta is coping with in terms of the second wave. So we are thinking of you, appreciate you taking the time. Dawn, thanks for having us in Edmonton. I got a few more sessions now to go and listen to. And as I said, I'm hoping Christopher Wilson will tune in next week. We're in Calgary all week. And we have a City Talk on Friday, a week from today, specifically on how community leaders are inspiring change in Calgary. And we look forward to having you join us then. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.